Welcome to Moon's Fairy Tales, where we journey into the realms of magic, mystery, and darkness. Today we have a special treat, a story inspired by the world of The Witcher. Get ready to explore new characters, hidden secrets, and a tale filled with danger and intrigue. Sit back, relax, and let yourself be transported to a world where every shadow hides a story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's dive in. The Whispers of the Blackwood. Part 1. The Darkened Road. In the desolate land of Velan, where the fog clings to the ground like a ghostly shroud, the air is thick with whispers. The Forest of Blackwood, known to many as the Shadowed Grove, stands tall and foreboding, its ancient trees twisting towards the heavens as if trying to claw their way out of the darkness. The villagers speak of strange occurrences, disappearances, whispers in the wind, shadows that move of their own accord. It is a place where the line between the living and the dead is but a thread, frayed and ready to snap. Cashin rode alone down a narrow path that wound through the heart of this forsaken land. His black cloak flapped like the wings of a raven in the cold night breeze. He had seen many horrors in his life as a monster hunter, but there was something about Velan that unnerved even him. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, a suffocating presence that seemed to whisper his name with every rustling leaf. His journey had begun weeks ago when he received a letter from an old acquaintance in Crow's Perch, begging for his help. The letter spoke of an evil presence awakening in the Blackwood, a force that defied even the most seasoned sorcerers and knights. And now, as he neared the village of Black Hollow, he could feel that same dark energy prickling at his skin, a sensation that made his stomach churn. The village appeared suddenly out of the mist, its dilapidated huts and muddy streets a stark contrast to the vast, impenetrable forest beyond. Cashin dismounted his horse and approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his silver sword. He noticed the eyes of the villagers watching him from behind shuttered windows, their faces gaunt and pale with fear. "Who goes there?" a voice called out from the darkness. Cashin turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was an old man, his face lined with years of hardship, his eyes glinting with a mix of suspicion and hope. "Name's Cashin," he replied, his voice steady, though he felt the tension in the air. "I was called here to deal with a problem." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the forest. You'll find plenty of those around here," he muttered. "The forest, it's cursed, they say. No one who goes in ever comes out the same, if they come out at all." Cashin frowned. "And what about the missing villagers? Any idea where they might have gone?" The old man shook his head. "Taken by the forest, or worse," he whispered, glancing around as if the trees themselves might be listening. "Some say it's the work of a leshen, others speak of a noonwraith that haunts the woods. But me, I think it's something older, something darker." Cashin nodded, his grip tightening on his sword. He had faced leshens and noonwraiths before. They were formidable but not insurmountable. Yet, the fear in the old man's voice hinted at something far more sinister, something ancient and malevolent. "Take me to the seer," Cashin said finally. "The one who sent for me." The old man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Aldera. She lives at the edge of the village, near the old mill. She sees things that no one else can." As they walked through the village, Cashin felt the eyes of the villagers on him, their fear palpable. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened further, as if the very light was being drained from the world. At the end of the road stood a small, crooked hut, its windows dark and foreboding. The old man stopped and gestured towards the door. "This is it," he said. "Good luck, hunter. You'll need it." Cashin stepped forward and knocked on the door. There was a long pause before it creaked open, revealing a woman cloaked in shadows. Her eyes were a piercing blue, and her face was marked with the scars of a life spent peering into the abyss. "You've come," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper that sent a chill down Cashin's spine. "I've been expecting you." Cashin nodded. "Aldera, I presume. I'm here to help with your problem." Aldera stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The inside of the hut was dimly lit, filled with strange trinkets and talismans hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. Cashin could feel the weight of her gaze on him as she shut the door behind them. "The forest is awakening," Aldera said, moving to a small table covered in maps and scrolls. "Something stirs within its depths, something that should have remained buried." Cashin felt a shiver run down his spine. "What is it?" he asked. "What are we dealing with?" Aldera's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and resolve. "An ancient evil," she whispered, "an entity that predates the conjunction of the spheres. It has been bound for centuries, but now the bindings are weakening. It feeds on fear, on darkness, on death." Cashin felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had heard tales of ancient entities, beings that existed long before humans or even elves walked the earth. They were not to be trifled with. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his chest. Aldera looked at him, her eyes burning with intensity. "We must find the source of its power," she said. "A relic hidden deep within the forest. Destroy it and we might stand a chance. Fail, and the darkness will consume us all." Cashin nodded, his resolve hardening. He had faced darkness before and emerged victorious. But this was different. This was a darkness that could not be slain with mere steel and fire. "Then we go into the forest," he said, his voice firm. "We find this relic and end this, once and for all." Aldera nodded, a grim smile playing on her lips. "Prepare yourself, hunter," she said softly. "For in the Blackwood, the shadows have teeth, and they are hungry." As Cashin stepped out into the cold night air, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of the damned. And in the distance, deep within the heart of the Blackwood, something ancient and malevolent stirred, its eyes opening for the first time in centuries, its hunger growing. And so the hunt began. Part 2, The Shadows of Blackwood. Cashin entered the Blackwood Forest with a sense of foreboding gnawing at his core. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything below in a perpetual twilight. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the very earth beneath him resisted his intrusion. He moved cautiously, his eyes darting to every shadow that seemed to shift and writhe like a living thing. The forest was alive in a way that defied nature, a sentient darkness that watched and waited. He had been following the trail of those who had vanished, villagers, hunters, even a few brave knights. All had disappeared without a trace, their last known locations marked by broken branches and faint, bloody smears. Cashin crouched beside a patch of disturbed earth, his gloved fingers brushing over a torn scrap of cloth. The chill in the air deepened, and he could almost hear the distant echoes of screams carried on the wind. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a low growl, guttural and inhuman. Cashin's hand flew to his sword, drawing it in a swift, practiced motion. His eyes scanned the underbrush, every muscle in his body tensed and ready. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, shadows that darted and twisted between the trees, too quick to be human. As he stepped forward, the shadows coalesced into grotesque forms, creatures half-formed, their bodies twisted with pain and madness. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Spirits of the damned, trapped between worlds. Cashin felt a cold sweat drip down his back. He had seen spirits before, but these were different. They were filled with a primal rage, a hatred that seemed to seep from their very being. One of the spirits lunged at him, its skeletal fingers reaching out to grasp him. Cashin swung his sword, the silver blade cutting through the air with a sharp whistle. The spirit dissipated with a shriek, vanishing into a wisp of smoke. But more were coming, their hollow eyes fixated on him. He could feel the malevolence in the air, a suffocating presence that sought to crush his spirit. He fought them off one by one, his sword slicing through the darkness. But for every spirit he banished, another seemed to take its place. Cashin knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He needed to find a way out of this madness. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, a voice rang out. A clear, melodic sound that cut through the darkness like a blade. "Hold your ground, hunter." Cashin turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, her features sharp and elfin, her silver hair cascading down her shoulders like a river of moonlight. She held a staff in one hand, and with a swift motion, she drew a circle in the air. The spirits recoiled, their forms flickering like candle flames in a strong wind. Within moments, they vanished, leaving only the stillness of the forest behind. Cashin lowered his sword, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who are you?" he demanded, still on guard. The woman stepped closer, her eyes piercing and filled with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "I am Talia," she said softly, "a healer and a keeper of secrets." Cashin eyed her warily. "A healer who knows how to banish spirits? That's an unusual skill." Talia gave a wry smile. "In Blackwood, one must learn many unusual skills to survive." Cashin sheathed his sword but kept his hand close. "You know this place well, then?" Talia nodded, her expression growing serious. "I've lived here for many years, long enough to understand the dangers that lurk in these woods. But recently, the darkness has grown stronger, more malevolent." Cashin frowned. "What's causing it? Why are the spirits so restless?" Talia's eyes darkened. "There is an artifact, an ancient relic known as the Amulet of Shadows. It has the power to corrupt and twist everything around it. For centuries it was hidden away, but now someone has found it, and they are using its power to bend the forest to their will." Cashin felt a chill run down his spine. "Who has it?" Talia glanced around nervously, as if the trees themselves might be listening. "A cult," she whispered. "Followers of the old gods, those who seek to bring back the age of chaos and darkness. They believe the amulet can grant them the power to summon an ancient entity, one that could shroud the world in eternal night." Cashin cursed under his breath. "And you're just telling me this now?" Talia's gaze was steady. "I needed to be sure you were not one of them, that you could be trusted." Cashin felt a flicker of annoyance but knew she was right. Trust was a rare commodity in these parts. "And now, Talia said, her voice firm, "we must stop them. If they succeed in their ritual, the forest will become a gateway to the void, and all manner of horrors will spill forth. We must find the cult's lair and destroy the amulet before it's too late." Cashin nodded. "Do you know where they are?" Talia nodded slowly. "Deep within the heart of the Blackwood, there is a place where the veil between worlds is thin, a place where the cult gathers. But it won't be easy to reach. The forest itself will try to stop us." Cashin tightened his grip on his sword. "Then we better get moving," he said grimly. "Lead the way, Talia." As they ventured deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Cashin could feel the darkness pressing in, a malevolent force that seemed to whisper in a language he could not understand. But he pushed on, driven by a determination to end this nightmare once and for all. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, unseen and unheard, the cult waited. They had sensed his presence, felt the disruption in the flow of magic, and they were ready for him. Part 3, The Cult of Nightmares. Cashin and Talia moved swiftly through the dense undergrowth of Blackwood, their footsteps silent against the carpet of fallen leaves. The air was thick with tension, each breath laden with the scent of damp earth and decay. Talia led the way, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She had lived in these woods long enough to know that the cult would not be far. Their presence lingered in the air like a sickness, corrupting everything around it. "We need to be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "The cultists are skilled in dark magic. They'll sense us before we see them." Cashin nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his silver sword. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, a suffocating presence that seemed to grow with every step. But he pushed the feeling aside. focusing instead on the task at hand. They needed to find the Amulet of Shadows and destroy it before the cult could complete their ritual. They moved deeper into the forest, the light from the setting sun barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The shadows grew longer, darker, and Cashin could feel the temperature drop as they approached a clearing. He motioned for Talia to stop, crouching low as he peered through the thick brush. In the clearing, a group of cultists had gathered, their black robes blending with the shadows. They chanted in a low, guttural language, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that sent a chill down Cashin's spine. In the center of the clearing stood an altar, carved from a single piece of black stone. Upon it rested the Amulet of Shadows, its surface glowing with an unnatural, dark light. Talia leaned in close, her breath warm against Cashin's ear. "We have to stop them now, before they can complete the ritual." Cashin nodded. "Stay behind me. We'll take them by surprise." He stood slowly, his sword drawn and ready. Talia followed, her staff held tightly in her hands. They moved as one, stepping into the clearing with a sudden burst of speed. The cultists turned, their eyes wide with shock, but they reacted quickly, drawing daggers and chanting incantations. Cashin swung his sword, the blade slicing through the air with a deadly hiss. The first cultist fell, blood spraying across the stone altar. Talia raised her staff, muttering a spell under her breath. A burst of light erupted from the tip, blinding several cultists and sending them reeling back. Cashin pressed forward, his sword cutting down another cultist, then another. But more were coming, emerging from the shadows like specters. They surrounded Cashin and Talia, their eyes burning with fanatic zeal. "Protect the amulet!" one of them shouted, his voice filled with madness. Cashin felt a surge of adrenaline. He fought with everything he had, his movements a blur of silver and steel. But the cultists were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. One of them managed to slip past his guard, striking him hard across the head with a heavy club. Stars exploded in his vision, and he stumbled, his grip on his sword loosening. Before he could recover, several cultists grabbed him, dragging him to the ground. He struggled, but they were too strong, their grip unyielding. He felt a sharp pain in his side as one of them drove a dagger into his ribs. He gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. Talia shouted his name, her voice filled with fear, but she was quickly overwhelmed. Her staff knocked from her hands as the cultists swarmed over her. Cashin was lifted, his arms bound behind him as they dragged him towards the altar. His vision blurred, blood dripping down his face. As he was forced to his knees before the altar, a figure stepped forward, his robe darker than the others, his presence commanding. His face was obscured by a hood, but his eyes, Cashin recognized those eyes. "Ravik," he spat, his voice filled with venom. Ravik smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Ah, Cashin," he said softly, his voice like silk. "I knew it was only a matter of time before you found your way here." Cashin struggled against his bonds, but the cultists held him firm. "You won't get away with this," he growled. "I'll kill you, just like I should have years ago." Ravik chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "You always were the stubborn one," he said, "but I'm afraid you're too late. The ritual is nearly complete, and soon, the Lord of Shadows will be unleashed upon this world." Cashin felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Why, Ravik?" he demanded. "Why are you doing this?" Ravik's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You never understood. The world is broken, Cashin, corrupt. It needs to be cleansed, purified in darkness. Only then can a new order be born." Cashin shook his head. "You're insane," he spat. "This won't bring back what you lost." Ravik's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You know nothing of loss," he hissed. "But you will. Soon, everyone will know." He turned to the cultists. "Prepare him for the sacrifice," he ordered. "We must complete the ritual before the moon rises." Cashin felt a surge of panic as the cultists dragged him towards the altar. He struggled, but his strength was fading, his vision blurring. He could hear Talia shouting in the distance, her voice desperate, but he couldn't make out the words. Just as he felt the cold stone of the altar beneath him, there was a sudden flash of light, a blinding, searing light that burned through the darkness. The cultists cried out in pain, shielding their eyes. Cashin felt the bonds around his wrists loosen, and he seized the moment, rolling off the altar and grabbing his sword. Talia stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands raised, her eyes glowing with a fierce light. She had broken free, using her magic to blind the cultists. "Cashin, run!" she shouted. Cashin didn't need to be told twice. He surged to his feet, his sword swinging in a wide arc, cutting down the nearest cultist. He sprinted towards Talia, his side burning with pain, but he forced himself to move. Together, they plunged back into the forest, the sounds of the cultists' shouts and Ravik's curses following them. They ran until they could no longer hear the cultists behind them, the dense trees swallowing the sounds of pursuit. Cashin collapsed against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps, blood dripping from his wounds. Talia knelt beside him, her expression grim. "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll come after us." Cashin nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain. "We need to find a safe place," he muttered. "Somewhere we can regroup." Talia helped him to his feet, supporting him as they moved deeper into the forest. Cashin could feel the darkness pressing in on him, his vision growing dim. He knew they were not safe, not yet. Ravik would not stop until he had the amulet, until he had unleashed the full power of the Lord of Shadows. And now Cashin had a price on his head. The cult would hunt them, relentlessly, until either they were dead or the world was plunged into darkness. Part 4: Blood and Betrayal. The days that followed their escape from the cult were a blur for Cashin. Every step through the dense thicket of Blackwood felt heavier, every breath more labored. The forest seemed to close in around him, its shadows growing longer, darker. Cashin's mind, once sharp and focused, now felt like a foggy battlefield, echoes of unknown voices whispering in the dark corners of his consciousness. Visions. They plagued him relentlessly, visions of his past, twisted into nightmarish contortions by a malevolent force. Faces of loved ones, long dead, appeared before him, their eyes hollow and accusing. Shadows danced on the edge of his vision, whispering secrets of betrayal and death. He would wake in a cold sweat, his hand clutching the hilt of his sword, ready to fight enemies that were not there. But the worst of all was the voice, Ravik's voice. It clawed at the back of his mind, sowing doubt and fear. "You cannot escape your fate, Cashin," the voice whispered in his dreams. "Your destiny is bound to the shadows. You will fall just as I did." Cashin shook his head, trying to clear the fog. He knew it was Ravik's magic, some dark spell meant to break his mind, to weaken him before the final confrontation. He couldn't afford to succumb to it. Not now. Not when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Talia noticed his torment. "Cashin," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "You haven't slept. You're not yourself." He turned to her, his eyes weary. "I'm fine," he muttered, though he knew the lie was thin. "Just keep moving. We're not safe yet." Talia nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. A flicker of hesitation, of doubt. He pushed the thought aside. They had been through too much together. He had to trust her. She was all he had left. But trust, he would soon learn, was a dangerous thing in Blackwood. They made camp that night near a small stream, the trickle of water a rare comfort in the oppressive darkness. Cashin sat by the fire, his sword resting on his lap, eyes scanning the shadows. Talia sat across from him, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet for most of the day, her usual sharp wit replaced by a distant, almost contemplative silence. Cashin closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the whispers, but the visions came again. Flashes of fire and blood, of faces contorted in pain. He could feel his sanity slipping, like a rope fraying under too much strain. When he opened his eyes, he found Talia watching him, her gaze intense. Cashin, she began, her voice soft but firm. There's something you should know. He frowned, sensing a shift in the air. What is it? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her staff. I haven't been entirely honest with you. Cashin felt his heart rate quicken. What do you mean? Talia took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. I've been working with Ravik. Cashin stared at her, the words not quite registering. What? I made a deal with him, she continued, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her eyes. For power, for vengeance. I thought I could use him to get what I wanted. But I never intended for things to go this far. Cashin rose to his feet, his hand instinctively moving to his sword. You betrayed me, he said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. You led me into a trap. Talia stood as well, her expression hardening. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Cashin. I was going to help you. Help me? Cashin spat, the betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. You were leading me to my death. Talia's eyes flashed with anger. You don't understand. Ravik promised me power beyond anything I could imagine. I could have had it all. Cashin felt a surge of fury. And at what cost, Talia? How many lives would you have sacrificed for your vengeance? Talia's gaze faltered, but only for a moment. As many as it takes, she said, her voice cold. But Ravik's a fool. He underestimates me. I never intended to follow him blindly. Cashin felt a sick realization dawn upon him. You're going to steal the amulet, he whispered. For yourself. Talia's lips curved into a sly smile. And why not? With the amulet, I could wield power unimaginable. I could reshape this world as I see fit. Cashin's grip tightened on his sword. I won't let you do this, Talia. I can't. She laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the trees. And who's going to stop me, Cashin? You? Ravik? You're both nothing to me. Before Cashin could respond, a figure stepped out from the shadows, the unmistakable silhouette of Ravik. He moved with an unnatural grace, his dark robes flowing like liquid shadow, his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Talia. So, Ravik said, his voice dripping with amusement, the little elf thinks she can betray the master of shadows. Talia spun around, her staff raised defensively. You always were a fool, Ravik, she sneered. You think you can control the darkness, but you're just as bound by it as anyone else. Ravik smiled, a thin, cruel smile. Perhaps, but you forget, Talia, I am the darkness. Without warning, Ravik raised his hand, a surge of dark energy erupting from his palm. Talia countered with a spell of her own, the two forces colliding in a blinding explosion of light and shadow. Cashin was thrown back by the force, his head spinning as he tried to regain his bearings. When his vision cleared, he saw Talia and Ravik locked in combat, their magic clashing in a violent storm of light and darkness. The ground beneath them trembled, the very air crackling with energy. Cashin knew he had to act fast. The power they were unleashing could destroy them all. He forced himself to his feet, his sword drawn. He knew he couldn't take them both on, he had to choose. His eyes flicked between Talia and Ravik, his mind racing. But before he could make a decision, Talia turned her gaze on him, her eyes filled with a dangerous determination. Cashin, she shouted, help me destroy him, and I'll share the power with you. We can rule together. Ravik's laugh cut through the chaos. Don't listen to her, Cashin. She'll betray you the first chance she gets. Join me and you'll have your revenge. You'll have power beyond your wildest dreams. Cashin's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. He tightened his grip on his sword and lunged forward, aiming not for Ravik or Talia, but for the amulet of shadows itself. His blade struck the amulet, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a wave of raw, destructive magic erupted from the shattered remains, spreading out in all directions. The force of it was like a tidal wave, tearing through the forest, uprooting trees, and turning the ground to ash. Blackwood were far from defeated. Cashin was thrown back, his body slamming into a tree. He felt a sharp pain in his side as something pierced his flesh. A branch or a shard of the amulet, he couldn't tell. The world around him blurred, the sounds of the forest drowning in a deafening roar. He could see Talia, her form flickering in and out of focus. She staggered to her feet, her eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," she snarled. "I will have my revenge. On both of you." Before Cashin could react, she vanished into the shadows, her figure dissolving into the darkness of the forest. Cashin tried to move, but the pain was too much. He could feel the blood seeping from his wounds, his strength fading fast. As the darkness closed in around him, he could hear Ravik's voice, a faint whisper in his mind. "You think you've won, Cashin," the voice said, "but this is only the beginning. The darkness will always find you. It always does." Cashin's vision dimmed, the world around him fading to black. He fought to stay conscious, to hold on to the last thread of life. But as the cold darkness embraced him, he knew one thing for certain. The shadows of Blackwood were far from defeated. Part 5, The Final Reckoning. The destruction of the Amulet of Shadows unleashed more than just a wave of destructive magic. It tore a rift between realms, freeing forces long confined to the dark corners of existence. The air in Blackwood grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was gasping for breath. From the torn veil between worlds, an ancient, primal force seeped into the land, a presence older than time itself. Cashin lay on the cold, hard ground, his body broken and bleeding. Every breath was a struggle, his vision blurred with pain. The voices in his head were silent now, replaced by a profound emptiness. He knew he was dying, but he also knew he could not give up, not yet. As he drifted between consciousness and the abyss, a familiar face appeared above him, Ilya, the ghostly apparition of his past love, her features soft and ethereal. She knelt beside him, her hand cool against his fevered brow. "Cashin," she whispered, her voice like a breeze through the leaves. "It's not your time yet. You have one last fight." Cashin blinked, trying to focus on her face. "Ilya, I can't. I'm too weak." She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You've always been stronger than you know, but this time you must let go of the past. Let go of the pain. Only then can you face the darkness." Cashin felt a surge of warmth, a fleeting, final burst of strength. He nodded, closing his eyes, and when he opened them again, Ilya was gone. In her place stood Talia, her form half hidden in the shadows, her eyes cold and hard. She held her staff tightly, the tip glowing with a faint, ominous light. "You're still alive," she said, almost disappointed. "I should have known you wouldn't die so easily." Cashin struggled to push himself up, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. "Talia," he rasped, "it's over. The amulet is gone. The forest is dying. You don't have to do this." Talia's eyes narrowed. "You think I care about this forest? About any of this?" She gestured around her, her voice filled with contempt. "All I ever wanted was power, a chance to make things right in my own way. And now, thanks to you, that's been taken from me." She raised her staff, the glow intensifying. "But there's still one thing I can do. One final act that will ensure my name is remembered long after you're gone." Before she could strike, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. Ravik, his presence as commanding and terrifying as ever. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his face a mask of fury. "Enough of this," he growled, his voice echoing like thunder. "You think you can defy me, little elf? You think you can take what's mine?" Talia turned to face him, her grip tightening on her staff. "Stay back, Ravik. I'll destroy you just as I did the amulet." Ravik's laughter was low and menacing. "The amulet's destruction was your doing, and now you will pay the price for your folly." He raised his hands, dark tendrils of energy swirling around him. "I have no need for trinkets to command the shadows. I am the shadows." The two forces clashed once more, their magic tearing through the air with a force that shook the very earth. Cashin watched from the ground, his mind racing. He knew he was outmatched, his strength was nearly gone, and his body was broken. But he also knew he couldn't just lie there and let the darkness win. With a grunt of pain, he pushed himself to his feet, his sword dragging in the dirt. He could see Talia and Ravik locked in a deadly duel, their power ripping through the forest like a storm. He had to do something, anything, to stop them. As he staggered forward, he saw it. A single remaining shard of the Amulet of Shadows, glinting in the pale moonlight. He knew what he had to do. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he reached for the shard, his fingers closing around it. He could feel the dark energy pulsing through it, a remnant of the amulet's terrible power. He raised the shard, focusing on the duel before him. He could see Talia and Ravik's energies colliding, their forces almost evenly matched. Almost, if he could just disrupt the balance, if he could just give one of them the edge. But which one? Ravik, the mad sorcerer who sought eternal darkness, or Talia, the betrayer who still held a glimmer of humanity in her heart? Cashin's hand trembled, the shard humming with dark energy. And then, with a surge of clarity, he made his choice. He threw the shard with all his might, not at Ravik or Talia, but between them, directly into the swirling vortex of their magic. The effect was immediate. The shard exploded in a blinding flash of light, sending both Ravik and Talia flying backward. The forest seemed to scream, the shadows recoiling from the burst of energy. For a moment there was silence, pure, absolute silence. Then the ground began to shake. The rift between realms, already unstable from the destruction of the amulet, began to widen. Cashin could see it. A tear in the very fabric of reality, growing larger, threatening to consume everything in its path. Ravik was the first to recover. He stumbled to his feet, his eyes wild with rage. "No!" he screamed. "You will not take this from me. I will not be denied." He raised his hands, preparing to unleash a final, desperate attack. But before he could, Talia, bloodied and battered, launched herself at him, her staff driving into his chest with a sickening crunch. Ravik gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and then he crumbled into dust, his body dissolving into the shadows. Talia stood over the spot where he had fallen, her breath ragged, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of triumph and regret. She turned to Cashin, her expression unreadable. "It's over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cashin shook his head. "No," he replied, his voice weak but firm. "It's not. The rift, it's still growing." Talia looked around, seeing the truth of his words. The rift was expanding, the edges crackling with dark energy. She knew what had to be done. She turned to Cashin, her eyes filled with a strange, sad resolve. "There's only one way to close it," she said softly. "One of us must go through, to the other side." Cashin's eyes widened. "Talia, no." She shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "It has to be me, Cashin. I'm the one who opened it. I'm the one who betrayed you. This is my redemption." Cashin wanted to argue, to stop her, but he knew it was futile. He could see the determination in her eyes, the acceptance. He nodded slowly, tears blurring his vision. "Talia!" She stepped forward, placing a hand on his cheek. "Take care of the world for me, Cashin," she whispered. "And remember, there's always light, even in the darkest of places." With that, she turned and walked toward the rift. Cashin watched as she stepped into the darkness, her form swallowed by the swirling void. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a blinding flash, the rift closed, sealing the breach between realms. The forest was silent. The shadows were gone. Cashin stood alone, his body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He looked around at the ruins of Blackwood, the once dark forest now bathed in the soft, silver light of the moon. He knew there was much to be done, wounds to heal, darkness to banish. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a moment to mourn the loss of a friend, a comrade, a betrayer who had found her redemption in the end. He sheathed his sword and took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. The world was still quiet, waiting, and in that moment, Cashin knew one thing for certain. The darkness had been pushed back, but the battle for the light was far from over. And as he turned to leave the forest, his footsteps light on the forest floor, a single final thought crossed his mind, a promise to himself and to the world he had vowed to protect. The shadows would never rise again. Before we dive deeper into the dark and twisted world of Cashin and the haunting mysteries of Blackwood, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you'll never miss a tale of treachery, magic, and redemption. And trust me, the shadows still have secrets to reveal. Your support helps keep the darkness at bay and brings these stories to life. So, go ahead, join our journey into the unknown.